Welcome to another segment of Provocative Conversations, destined to provoke further thought and spark greater questions regarding God, church, and the religious establishments of both the past and the present. I am the proud heretic, Mr. Provocateur himself. In this segment, I am going to flow out of my pain, out of my current, and I'm sure past experiences, my experience that is ongoing, and I'm just going to speak as I move forward. I'm just going to flow with where I go. Sometimes these type segments, messages, conversations tend to go seemingly outside of the Bible, of what we know in regards to God, even though he says, my ways are not your ways and my thoughts are not your thoughts. And even as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways and thoughts above your ways and thoughts. And it says he takes the foolish things of this world to confound the wise. And yet, so many people think that if what you're saying and if what you're experiencing goes outside of the confines of the 66 books of the Bible, then that's not God. Well, I tend to differ. I kick down the doors with different, because that's not true. There's a lot of things that Jesus did that went outside of the confines of the Bible. It says in itself that had there have been enough space, or there wouldn't have been enough space on this earth, on this planet, or at least the world that they saw it as back then, had all of the things that Jesus spoke of and had done in, I guess, a 3-year segment of his life, just a mere 3-year segment, that the world itself couldn't contain all the books that are written therein. But yet we feel as though if it's not in the Bible, then it's not God. And I beg to differ. I don't beg to differ. I demand to differ. I demand to be different. That which is or was permitted in Egypt is not permitted in the promised land. That which is or was in Egypt is not permitted in the promised land. Making the distinction between Egypt and the promise. I'm realizing in my household, and I'll speak from my household, and whoever hears this message, you speak to it from wherever you see fit. You see where it fits. In my household, I have spoken about how the Bible says, how can two walk together except they be in agreement? In other words, there'll be a lack of common unity, a lack of community, a lack of togetherness if you're not on the same page. I hear so many people say, we don't have to agree on everything. Well, I somewhat differ from that. we should agree on most things. That's my opinion. Because the more you agree on, the more you can walk together on and in. So in my household, I've always pushed being in agreement, not being in agreement with my opinion or my kids' opinion or my spouse's opinion necessarily, but being in the opinion and in agreement in the opinion of, or agreement in opinion with truth, whatever truth is. Truth doesn't have to be an issue where, where you think Moses was 6'3" and 190 pounds, and I think he was 5'4" and 125 pounds. No agreement like that. That's petty. I'm talking those areas where without proper agreement, you can't even move forward. There's no forward motion without that necessary agreement. I am a big promoter of unity and being one with each other. It just works better when it's that way. And I believe Jesus was that as well. He was for that as well. And he said, Father, that they might be one as you and I are one. There's a necessity for oneness. So I'm one who pushes that. When I think about Egypt and I think about the promised land, it brings me before Egypt, or not so much before Egypt, but before Egypt became a long, extended conversation throughout the chapters, the upper chapters of Genesis, and then leading into the first half or a little less in the book of Exodus, which would bring me back to Isaac. Well, it'll bring me back to Joseph and his brothers. First of all, let's stay there. Joseph and his brothers. So we'll deal with Joseph and his brothers. Joseph and his brothers, Jacob, his 12 sons, were the offspring of Abraham, and the promises of God were to flow through that lineage. So here you have Joseph with Jacob, or Jacob having Joseph, one of the sons that he had, one of the 12 sons that he had. And here's Joseph being hated by his father's other kids, hated by his other brothers. I would call it hate or hating on. Let's put it that way. Let's be safe and say they were hating on him. They were jealous. His father either saw something or he just naturally had something for Joseph that was unique, and it stood out from what the brothers felt apparently that their father had toward them. So they, because of their hate of Joseph, decided to get rid of Joseph. A few wanted to kill him, but the ultimate decision was, let's just throw him in a well of water or a dry well, and let's trade him off. We'll trade him off. Eventually they traded him off to, I think, distant cousins. And those cousins took Joseph into Egypt. Without going into the details of Egypt, Joseph ended up being put in prison, and he ended up being released from prison, and then he ended up going promoted to a high level. There was a dream involved. There was a famine that was coming for, I think, 7 years. That's not important. I'm just going for the gist of the message. there were going to be years of plenty and then some years of famine. And Joseph became, because of his interpretation of the dream, Joseph became favored, and he ultimately he was moved to a high position. And in that high position, he was to be in control of all the food. So when the world of that time period was dealing with the famine and struggling to find food, that Joseph would be in position to give out the necessary food that those people would have in that time period, or during that time period, in which he did. Now, what God had done was God set it up where the sons, Joseph's brothers, their father, Jacob, would eventually have to send the sons to Egypt to buy food, because Egypt had plenty stored up during those plenty years. Unbeknownst to his brothers, Joseph was put into a high position, and he was over the food. So now his brothers, being sent by their father, went into Egypt to buy food. And they ended up living out a vision that Joseph had when he was younger and when he was home with his father and his brothers, where his brothers were coming to bow to him. Well, Joseph, when he realized that those were his brothers, and of course they did not know that that was Joseph, they didn't recognize him, but he recognized them. Skipping through the story, the brothers were afraid because they knew what they had done. They knew that they traded their brother. They sold their brother, and they told their father a lie, stating that their brother was eaten, their brother was killed or attacked by a wild whatever. But it wasn't true. And of course, Jacob was brokenhearted. Well, I'll just leave it at that. Jacob was brokenhearted. But everybody moved on. And now Joseph is standing before his brothers, and they're needing him, not recognizing him, but him knowing them. He eventually told them, I am your brother. I'm the one you sold into slavery. You sold me into this that I'm in now. His brothers were afraid. They got scared because they thought, man, he's in a position now that he could probably have us killed or what have you. But Joseph, after gaining some type of control over his emotions, he said to his brothers, don't worry about what you did. This is Genesis, I think, chapter 45. Don't worry about what you did. It's okay, because you didn't do it. God did this. God did this to preserve many lives. It goes on into Genesis chapter 50, and Joseph said, what you did. Now remember, Joseph said his brothers did it. But then also remember, Joseph said God did it. So in Genesis 50, Joseph says, you did it. You meant it for evil. You had your own intent outside of God's intent. But God had some intent inside or outside of your intent. God had a greater intent. And God's intent was for me to save many lives. God's intent was good, but your intent was evil. Your intent was opposite of God's. Your intent was not in line with God's intent. So now here you have the family of Joseph, the tribes of Israel within their loins, and now their father there in Egypt with Joseph and his brothers, and they were granted the land of Goshen. And here they are in Goshen, good land, good fertile land. and they prospered in Goshen. Goshen, everything was beautiful, or it seems to imply that everything was beautiful. Everything was lovely. Everything was just how God meant for it to be during their time in Goshen or in Egypt. And then, of course, Joseph and his brothers and his father, they all die off. And now you have 400 years or whatever, 400 years plus. You end up in the book of Exodus where God is telling the children of Israel, I'm here to deliver you. Moses is my spokesman. Pharaoh, let my people go. Now here you have the children of Israel now leaving out of Egypt and going out into the wilderness. These people don't even know God. They're going into a new state with this God that Moses is telling them about. This God who did some magical things in Egypt. And I'm sure it's probably seen as magical because they had the magicians in Egypt. The children of Israel weren't raised in church. So undoubtedly, they must have seen it as some type of magic because the magicians, they challenged everything that Moses did and they tried to replicate what Moses did and all. So I'm sure that the children of Israel, not having a strong foundation in God at that point in time, didn't know God. And they didn't know how to attribute what he was doing to it being anything outside of just magic or witchcraft or whatever they believed in at that time. Now God is moving the children of Israel out of Egypt and into the promise. And this is where I get Egypt versus the promised land. Now, in the promised land, God said, I'm bringing you into a land, houses you didn't build and fields that you didn't plant, that you didn't break the hard soil. I'm bringing you into a land flowing with milk and honey, plenty, much nourishment, beautiful. It's your destiny. And what I'm learning in my family, and I've learned in such hard ways, such hard, crushing ways. What I'm learning in my family and in my life right now, which I know will help people, is that what was permitted in Egypt is not permitted, not necessarily in your promised land. See, Egypt represents all those relationships, whether it was mother, father, sister, brother, aunts, uncles, cousins, nieces, nephews, friends, acquaintances, whatever. Those relations of whatever sort are not necessarily permitted to go forth into your promised land, into your destiny, into what God has destined you for. Please understand what I'm saying. There is a verse in the New Testament where Jesus says, who is my mother? Who is my father? But, or except those who do the will of my Father. We get so caught up on who people are in our natural, who people are by our birthright, that we become blinded to our purpose, to our destiny. We allow all of that to interfere in our pursuit in destiny, of destiny, through destiny. Whatever friendships we had, whatever relationships we had, whatever acquaintances we had in Egypt, in our past, before our knowledge, before our enlightenment, before our purposed pursuit of destiny, just because God, those were ordained relationships, friendships, and acquaintances. They were ordained because we don't get to choose our mother or our father or our offspring, at least not our siblings. We don't get to choose necessarily our nieces and nephews and cousins and all of that other stuff. We don't get to choose all of that. A lot of us in those early years didn't get to choose our church and our church acquaintances, our affiliations. But yet God established us, because there's a verse in the Bible that says God establishes our borders. He determines where we live. That's in the book of Acts. We think we're determining where we live, and yet it's God who determines where we live and where we go and where we set up our tents, where our dwelling place is, where our parameters are. So what we had established, or what was established for us in our Egypt, it was definitely God. It was due to the hands of God. But just because God establishes a place for us and acquaintances, relationships, biological relationships and all for us in our Egypt, or during our Egypt experience, during our dispensation, during our ordained period in Egypt, does not necessarily mean that God is still with you trying to establish and maintain those particular relationships in your promise. See, your promised land may not allow you to bring everything that you want to bring from your Egypt experience. The children of Israel, that's what having the unsweetened, the unleavened bread was about. It was about, just briefly throwing it out here, it was really about them showing the urgency that was necessary when it came time for the children of Israel to leave Egypt in pursuit of their promised land. There wasn't time to make the cakes or the bread all pretty. You had to get up and move. When the time came to move, you couldn't be slow. You had to go get them, or you had to go for your promise, your destiny. Now, as with the children of Israel who were in Egypt at that time, or getting ready to depart Egypt, God said to them, I don't want you to try to bring everything or whatever, but the other people gave them, the Egyptians gave them their gold and their silver and all of their other precious jewels and whatever, which ultimately went into another purpose and plan of God in the promise. So some things they were able to bring because it fit in their promise, because all of that gold and silver and stuff fit into the building of the temple later on, in the building of the garbs and all that Aaron and the priests and all wore. And it all had its place. All that was permitted to go into Egypt, or that they were permitted to bring with them into Egypt. But where we go wrong at today is we try to bring the relationships, the established friendships and acquaintances that we had during our Egypt experience over into our promise. We try to fit all of that into our destiny. But what we don't understand is that in our place of destiny, it may very well include some, if not all of those acquaintances, relationships and all, but more likely than not, it won't include all of them. In fact, for some, it may not include any of them. You may be the only one, Abram. You may be called out of your entire family to be the only one going the route that you're going. You may be the trailblazer. You may be the first of all fruit, or of any fruit from whence you came. But yet we try to pull all of this Egypt experience and all of those that we become acquainted with we've been connected to in our Egypt experience over into our promised land. And then we try to put the blessing of the promised land on them as though they are part of the promised land. No, the promise, which speaks of your destiny, may very well not even include those people. Why? Because they may not be at the level that you are. They may not be in the space and place that you are. They may not be tied to anything significant to where you're pursuing, to where God has you moving toward. And it's when you go into your promise, trying to bring all of that mess, all of that old, blessed, God ordained stuff over into your promised land, that you get yourself in trouble. God didn't want the children of Israel, when they came out of Egypt, to be worshiping any other God, to have no other God before them. He didn't want them to have the mindset of the gods that they learned and were affiliated with in Egypt. He wanted them to have a new mind and to understand him and to learn of him. And he wanted them to be in pursuit of what it is he was doing in their life, what their purpose was, what their destiny was. But then they spent 40 years in the desert just wandering around, because even though they had left Egypt, the mindset of Egypt had never left them. So now they're sitting in the wilderness, just spinning their wheels. They're right there in the parameters, or surrounded, based pretty much by their purpose, by their destiny. But yet they were so engulfed in their mind in regards to all that they had in Egypt and all that they brought mentally into their pursuit of their destiny from Egypt, that they were sidetracked, and they spent 40 years just wandering, just steadily practicing, trying to hold on to and to maintain nearly everything that they were supposed to leave behind in Egypt. If a person isn't careful, they will allow their Egypt experience to dominate their promise. They'll never actually get to see that milk and honey flow, because they're so caught up in what they had from Egypt and what they left behind, as though God doesn't understand why we're to leave certain things behind. There are just certain friends that cannot be put. I despise pretty much that word friend, because people have such a low standard for what a friend should be. I know that I have been a friend to many people, but I'm not going to even sit here and try to make it seem that I've had more than one or two friends that I can recall. My standard for friendship is high, and I meet those standards. But I've not seen people to meet those standards in regards to me. People say, well, maybe your standard is too high, so now you want me to drop the standard like everyone else has. Not going to do it. Now, the Bible says, do unto others as you would have others do unto you. Well, that's how I live. I do unto others as I would have them do up to me. Do unto me. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't mess up at times, not in my necessarily friendship, just my dealing with people. Sometimes I get lost in myself, and I might say something or whatever before thinking, or even in thinking, and say to hell with it and just say something or whatever. And I don't necessarily want that said to me. So I'm wrong there if I'm to do unto others as I would have them do unto me. But I will say this here. I do, when it comes to being a friend, I friend myself to others the way that I would want others, and I desire for others to friend themselves to me. However, I don't see people doing that to me, toward me, that I do toward them. That's a hard way to live, to know how you just give the shirt off of your back and you're there at any moment, at any whim, in any call, any text, any email, any whatever. You're right there. You wanting to help. You wanting to do all you can. You tire yourself. You don't leave the situation until you know the situation is either under control or rectified. You just want to do right. But I don't get that reciprocated. That's never necessarily reciprocated toward me, whether it's in my household or whether it's outside of the house, whatever. I've just not had that, but I've made sure that I do my best to be that toward and with other people. But we try so hard to bring friends and our old acquaintances, whether it's our blood family, we want them to be right where we are. We want them to be in the how would I say, in the throngs of everything that we have going on in our promise, in our pursuit of our purpose and our calling. We just ignore the fact that, look, that was for then. This is now. Just like God sets up acquaintances, friends, and family members to walk you through one dispensation, he also generally, for the most part, sets up new friends and new relations and whatever for another dispensation. This is one of the problems with marriage today. So many spouses, whether it's the husband or the wife, maybe sometimes it's both of them, whether it's the husband or the wife, they try to bring their family through the marriage as well. They try to have the best of both worlds. It's like they want the best of both worlds. I want Egypt and I want the promise. I want the milk and honey and I want the issues of Egypt as well. You can't have both. Goshen was okay, but Goshen was okay in the dispensation, the time period that God had you in Goshen. It is not okay to still want to hang out in Goshen now, because God has already said, get up, let's move. We're going into the promise. Follow the cloud. Follow the pillar of fire by night. Go where my spirit is leading you. Go with who I put as your leader, as your helpmeet. Follow him as he follows me. But we're wanting to pull everybody else with us. It reminds me of Sodom and Gomorrah, where Lot and his wife, and his family, Lot and his family were pulled out of Sodom, Gomorrah, as it was supposedly being destroyed. And then it says, God said, don't look back, or something like that. And then Lot's wife looked back and turned into a pillar of salt or whatever. The thing is, she looked back. Here God was telling them to move, or the angels or whoever were telling her, the family, to move. High step it out of this here. You're leaving your imprisonment. You're leaving your Egypt. You're leaving your dispensation, or the period, the dispensation, the period that you're in right now. You're going into another period. I don't need you to look back. I don't need you to look at what you left behind or who you left behind. Because where you're going, the urgency of where you're going and the need for where you're going, the purpose for which you're going, is not fit or cannot contain all of that in all of them as well. So then inside of marriages, because we try to pull all of our old experiences with the new experience that God has us in, you end up having marital problems, and you end up having schisms and isms and divisions and confusions and all manner of strife and contention and hatred and resentment and jealousy. Just crazy stuff. If you want to call it evil, evil. Evil meaning, from the way that I'm using it, evil meaning that which is not wholesome or healthy to where God is taking you, to your purpose, to your destiny. Bringing all of this evil that was once permitted, that was once granted by God. But just because a thing was granted at one period in time, in one dispensation of time, does not mean that you can move that stuff over into the new dispensation period that you're in. It brings me to, like the New Testament says, old wineskin and new wineskin. Wineskin was literally what it sounds like. It was the skin of animals, and you would take the skins of animals and you would plug the holes where the arms and legs and stuff would come through and whatever, and you plug the holes, and then you pour wine into the skins as like a jar or whatever, and it holds the wine. But as wine maturing, it gives off gases. The process of fermentation is taking place and it's giving off gases. Well, if you have old wineskin that has already been wineskin that's been stretched multiple times for a lengthy period of time, and then you take those wineskins and and then you try to put new wine into that old wineskin. That wineskin it can't breathe, it can't move, it can't expand with the potency, the gases that are going to be given off by that new wine that you're placing in there. So now the new wine is wasted because the old wineskin burst. Egypt is old wineskin. You're now dealing in new wineskin in your promise. You can't bring old wineskin of Egypt into your promise, into your destiny, into your purpose, into your marriage, and then think that that's supposed to produce good. It cannot produce good. Again, how can we walk together except we be in agreement? And the agreement, oftentimes the agreement can just be the agreement of purpose. If whatever it is, whoever they are, maybe you cannot bring them or it into your purpose if they are not in agreement and in healthy relationship in regards to your purpose. If they don't give a hoot about your spouse, if they don't give a hoot about where God has you at, you don't need to have them wandering around in the land of your promise. They need to be where they are. Because it's when we try to take those things of old and add them into our new, find ourselves in conflict, not with just them, but with all the new relationships that God preordained and ordered for us to have in our pursuit of destiny. So now the old residents or the old relationships, friendships, acquaintances are now battling with the new. Why? Because they're on different pages. They're representing different dispensations, different time periods. You can't mingle and mix the two unless they were purposed to go with. And all were not purposed to go with. All weren't even allowed while the children of Israel who came out of Egypt, all were not allowed to go into the promised land. Some were able to see it afar off, but they weren't allowed. Aaron wasn't allowed. The head leader, Moses, wasn't allowed. But then Joshua was, and many other, Caleb. Everyone cannot move over into your promise, even though all of you at one point in time lived in the land together, and you lived in the house together, and you lived in Egypt together, and all good, fine, well, wonderful, dandy. God had his plans and purposes for that dispensation in time. But we need to be able to distinguish the different dispensations in time so that we don't confuse ourselves, that we don't become confused, because not only will this confuse and cause division and strife amongst the different relationships and friendships of two different dispensations, two different periods in time for serving two different purposes in the time periods of your life, and serving two different purposes for two different time periods in your life. But you will also find yourself confused, divided, upset, angry, at odds against people in the people within the relationships and friendships and acquaintances that you are divinely set up to come into in reference to your promise. You will find yourself at odds with them too. Why? Because, like in the Old Testament, it said there's sin in the camp. There's sin in the camp. There are issues within the relationships that you're having outside or alongside the relationships that are the ones that are designed for where you are. You got these outside relationships interfering, and there's just nothing but a bunch of division and strife and hatred and whatever else. It just all follows because you're pulling stuff in that should not be. Your promise can't contain all of that unless God purposed for it to. But you will know who you should cut off and who you shouldn't cut off. And it'll be based upon how do these individuals, how does this particular thing fit and work in conjunction with what God is saying, with where I know God is leading me, with where I know God is pointing the person that's in my life, my spouse. Is this causing friction between us? Is this bringing about a certain type of discord? Is there division, confusion? Is there strife? Is there bitterness? Is there anger? Is there hatred coming forth? Is there jealousy? Is there envy involved? Better yet, is there lying involved? Is there deception going on in regards to those relationships where your spouse doesn't even know? Are you having to sneak and do these things? Are you finding reasons to sneak and do these things? Should you be functioning in these relationships on a down low? These friendships on a down low? If indeed God has orchestrated for those relationships to continue in the way that they once did, or the friendships to continue in the way that they once did when you were in another dispensation in time? Or are you doing this because that's the only way that you can swindle them in and mix them in to where you are today? Everyone, I heard this said some years ago. I don't know who it was said by, probably 20 years ago. I don't know who it was said by, but a guy said, you can't put everybody on the stage God has placed you on. You can't bring everybody to the podium of where God has opened up doors and purpose for you to speak, for the stages that God has purposed for you to be on. You can't put everybody on that stage. Everybody ain't clean enough. Everybody ain't fixed up enough. Everybody hadn't gone through what a person needs to go through in order to get on a stage like that, to be presented like that. Everybody ain't to the point of being or even willing or desiring to be vessels of honor. They're still in the process of being vessels of dishonor. If people aren't healthy to God's purpose and God's plan for you, then you need to cut them off. You don't have to be nasty. You still know them. You still help them. You still hello to them. You got to tell them, I love you. Tell them, I love you. It is what it is. Love has such a weak meaning today. It's so sad. But anyway, but you need to know, there was a song, Kenny Rogers. He said, you got to know when to hold them, know when to fold them. You gotta know who to hold and then who to fold, who to just throw down. I just lay it down. That's it. This is as far as we go. One thing I learned early on is there were some relationships, some friendships that I thought would last forever with me. There were even some friendships that I prayed. I remember when I was leaving Germany, a guy who helped me in Germany a lot because he was an American. He was once in the military, but he had gotten out years prior to me coming to Germany, and he stayed there, and he married a German female, and they had kids and all, and he was living on the German economy, and he understood the language and whatever, and he was able to help me. I met him at an American church on an Army base one night that I went to preach a message. Well, he spoke before I did, and then I got up and spoke, and then he came to me and he said, I feel that God has put both of us together and whatever, and he helped me throughout my time period, all the way up to the time of us, my wife and I, along with our first child, leaving Germany. And he stayed at the hotel with me for maybe a week as we were processing out of the military. We had already moved out of base housing, and we were in a German hotel, but on an Army base. And he stayed there with me for that whole week, waiting on me to depart. And we made a pact, and we prayed together and said, God, may we never end this relationship, and whatever else, may this be a lasting, long, forever relationship, and whatever else. And over the years, he came back and forth to visit me in the United States, and we visited each other. And then he and his family moved back to the United States, and then we went to visit them in their state that they were in. So we were back and forth to the Carolinas, to Kentucky, to Florida, South Florida. We were good. But then it came to an end because we moved into a dispensation, a different period, a different time. We even moved into different dimensions in regards to how we think and how we see God and how we see the Bible. And then our friendship was no longer friendly. Our relationship was strained. He couldn't understand me. He felt that I had become a heretic. He said that God told him to never be around me again. I'm the proud heretic, remember? So anyway, I realized from that and from many other things that those relationships were what they were supposed to be in the time period that they were supposed to be. But those periods are long gone, forever gone. They are no more. Move on. It's time to move on. You can't bring them where God is taking you. Your revelation is too powerful. Your understanding of God is too deep. The dimension that you're in will get them. It's combustible. You trying to bring them to that depth of the sea of God will cause their eardrums to burst. You trying to bring them to that level, to that height, it'll cause their lungs to burst because they can't expand. It's too high. It's too deep. It's too strong. It's too rich for them, for where they are. They're not necessarily wrong, not necessarily. It's just that they can't go where you are. This isn't their route, and they aren't along the route that God is now taking you. They were good for the route that God had you on, but now it's time to move on. And if you try to build something, it's just gonna be friction. There'll be no flow there anymore. There'll be no agreement there. How can two walk together except they be in agreement? A house divided against itself cannot stand. And we're trying to make a house stand with all the junk that we got inside of the house, pushing the walls of the house outward. Well, if you push the walls of the house outward, that means the ceiling is coming down on you all, and it will just be a mass destruction. It'll just be a bunch of rubble. And that's what's happening with marriages, a bunch of rubble. Because of all that we have in there, we're trying to put all of these people in there who are not even equipped, who are not even ready to be there. Everybody can't hear what's going on. Everybody can't see what's going on. Everyone don't need to know what's going on. Everyone doesn't need to be around what God is doing in and through you, in your new dispensation, in your promise, in your destiny, in your marriage. And I'm just finding this out, not finding this out, but I'm discovering different levels and dimensions of what I'm saying as I'm living. And again, I said, I'm speaking through my pain. I'm speaking through my experience, or my experience says. This is a serious matter. Just because it was permitted in Egypt does not mean that it's permitted to go with you in the promised land. And your milk and honey will only flow in your promise, in your destiny. Your milk and honey is not flowing out of Egypt. Stop acting as though your milk and honey is coming from everything that you had from Egypt. And you're not going to die if you have to sever contacts, relationships with people of your past, no matter who they are. Because one thing about God, remember, he has no respecter of persons. Only we have respect of persons. We can't take it because of who it is. Don't you know that God wouldn't have ever been able to work through Jesus had he have gotten caught up on the fact that that's my son on the cross? But yet we say, oh no, that's my, and that's my. Jesus said, who is my mother? Who is my father? Except him, them that do the will of my Father. You can't serve two masters. You can't serve two gods. You can't serve two dispensations. They don't work. They don't agree. They're not in agreement. It's just not the way it is, people. Maybe this will help you. Maybe you can take it and stretch it further for your situation. Again, this is not something that I've necessarily studied. This is just something that I've analyzed in my own experience and in my own pain, my own hurt. And it's up to you and God to take it to a different level. Peace to you.